So Greensill is or was a company that provided something called supply chain finance. Now this can get a little bit complicated, but effectively what Greensill did was act as an intermediary between sellers and buyers of various different products in the international economy. Greensill it was kind of like a shadow bank. It stepped in to provide financing for customers that wanted to pay later and sellers that wanted to receive the money for the things that they were selling immediately. And effectively, that is similar to the kind of stuff that banks would not ordinarily do. But Greensill was able to pitch what it was doing as something that had very little to do with finance and a lot to do with tech, with the kind of glamorous new technology economy, and therefore attract quite a lot of capital, quite a lot of investment, and very little regulatory oversight. So Greensill was basically pumping lots and lots of money into the global economy in various different ways with various different clients, whilst facing very little oversight from any regulators. And that made it very fragile. A lot of people noticed that Greensill's business model looked very unsustainable many years ago, and the regulators were still pretty slow to catch up. Ultimately, with everything that happened during the global pandemic, Greensill's business model proved as fragile as was expected, and the firm collapsed. And when it collapsed, a lot of interesting arrangements that it had made with senior politicians, with business leaders around the world came to light, which might explain why this firm wasn't regulated in the way that it should have been. To understand what David Cameron is accused of having done and the scandal that has grown up around his actions with regards to Greensill, we need to put that in the context of the global pandemic. Because governments all around the world are now providing a great deal of money to private businesses to keep them afloat, whether that's small businesses or in some cases, very big businesses like Greensill. And the Bank of England has a fund through which it purchases the debt of large companies, effectively in order to make sure that those companies can meet their short to medium term obligations to their creditors. It's kind of grease to the wheels of the global financial system. And a lot of different firms have benefited from that. A lot of very big firms have benefited from that. Now, what David Cameron did was try to lobby the government to ensure that Greensill was included in that, what is effectively a loan program, in the Bank of England's scheme to make it easier for companies to borrow and to allow them to get over these kind of short-term financing difficulties. Now, the issue there is that Greensill wasn't just facing short-term financing difficulties because of the pandemic. Greensill was fundamentally a completely unsustainable and ultimately insolvent company that should never have been receiving state support and that probably should never really have existed, or if it did, at least should have been properly regulated. So Cameron's lobbying really comes down to the position that he held at Greensill as an advisor. And the reason that he got that position is because he made Lex Greensill, the eponymous founder of Greensill Capital, an advisor to his government back when he was in charge of the country. So this is really a question of kind of favors being passed around between big business and the state and the finance sector. And it, in that sense, speaks to a much bigger problem of politicians and business people basically being in each other's pockets. What I think is interesting about this question is when you speak to a lot of the most wealthy and powerful people in the global economy, it's less about having that extra million or 10 million pounds or dollars, and it's more about your power and influence. I think at a certain level of wealth, obviously it's not going to make you any happier to have an extra, 10, 20, 30, 40 million pounds, or even, 1 million pounds. But that's not really the thing that's at stake here. What's at stake is your standing in the global billionaire class. You're standing in the global political class. And what a lot of people, especially former politicians, want to do is ensure that they continue to be relevant, is ensure that they continue to be respected, that they are asked to come and address big conferences and to support businesses and to retain that position within the global elite. And actually, I think that is the thing that these people find most challenging about socialism. It's not necessarily the redistribution of wealth, although that is obviously an issue. It's the fact that they would lose that sense of identity that makes them feel like they're special, they're important, they're wanted in the room, they're the ones that are making the decisions. And I really do think that that is why a lot of our former politicians end up going into these kind of business arrangements. And it's also why a lot of business people try to make sure that they are inserted into the right rooms to be talking to politicians, and why they're the ones getting huge salaries and huge payouts and huge bonuses, even when they know that that's potentially going to damage their reputation and the reputation of their firm in the wider public. It's all about seeming like you're the top dog. You're the one that's at the very, very top of the pile. And I think, associated with that, it's not a coincidence that a lot of these people are men, because it is this kind of macho testosterone. And, women aren't excluded from it at all. Obviously, that would be ridiculous to say. There are plenty of wealthy and powerful women at the top of the global economy who do buy into those dynamics. But there is this very particular thing of wanting to be the top dog, the chief, the head of everything, the most powerful, the most influential, the guy that everyone comes to. And you see that in the business world, you see it in politics. It's really how I think capitalism continues to function. It plays into that macho, patriarchal need to be the one who's in charge. And that is the kind of economy we live in. It's not the case. We're told that we live in this free market, decentralized system where we're all individual producers and consumers, and we all have this freedom. Actually, no. There's a couple of very, very powerful people and institutions who are in charge of a lot of basically deciding who gets what. Yeah, there is a whole nother video that you need to do on the relationship between the British and Saudi states. And, Cameron and many other leaders will have spoken extensively about Britain's role in protecting and upholding human rights around the world. And yet, they see absolutely no problem in going to have long, extensive meetings with Saudi Arabia, which is, of course, an incredibly authoritarian, repressive regime. It's accused of human rights abuses in multiple conflicts, not least the humanitarian crisis that we're seeing at the moment in Yemen. And political leaders who claim to want to uphold human rights and freedom have no problem with meeting with these people. It comes back again to this hypocrisy. We are told we are free. We are told we live in a democracy. And yet there is this cabal of people at the very top of all our political and economic institutions who have a huge amount of influence and sway in determining how politics works, how the global economy works, how, global conflicts play out, and how we're all treated at work, in our communities, and just in society as a whole. And this just completely and utterly encapsulates that. It just shows that some of these people are shameless in their desire to continue to be part of that global elite, that decision-making class. David Cameron and Lex Greensill went on a lobbying trip to Saudi Arabia, of course on a private jet, to visit Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. Greensill was trying to expand his operations into Saudi Arabia, and Cameron thought it would be a good idea for him to go along and help to grease the wheels. Lex Greensill was the founder of Greensill Capital, a now defunct company that provided various forms of what's called supply chain financing. Effectively, Greensill Capital was a giant shadow bank. It was a huge, unregulated financial organization providing liquidity to companies all over the world. Greensill was also involved in David Cameron's government. He had what is now being described as a very significant advisory role in the Cameron government. And of course, as a favour when Cameron left office, Cameron went to work as an advisor to Greensill. So Lex Greensill is someone who is intimately linked to the circuits of global capital, to the power of the international elite. He knows everyone from Tony Blair to Mohammed bin Salman to David Cameron. A variety of different figures have been linked with Lex Greensill. And as his company collapsed, as it ultimately was always going to do because its business model was fundamentally unsustainable, these links have slowly emerged. And it has become clear that the reason that Greensill was able to survive for so long was that Lex Greensill basically had a whole number of politicians all over the world effectively in his pocket. David Cameron was firing off texts at all hours of the day to Rishi Sunak, asking him to include Greensill Capital in the Bank of England's scheme to support big businesses through financing difficulties that they may have had during the pandemic. Cameron was consistently texting Sunak, asking him to consider including Greensill Capital in these schemes that provided emergency lending. Rishi seemed initially reticent. He's not replying to Cameron according to some of the texts. He's kind of saying, I'll call you later. But it has emerged that Sunak did push for Greensill Capital to be included in these schemes, as did actually a number of different political leaders and politicians. It wasn't just Cameron and Sunak. Lex Greensill was able to influence a whole number of people to push for Greensill Capital to be included in this scheme. Now, ultimately, Greensill did not receive that funding from the Bank of England, which is clearly a good thing. Clearly, someone at the Bank of England could see that Greensill was a very, very unsustainable business and that it would not look good for the British state to be financing it. But the fact that all of these politicians pushed so hard for Greensill to get this money just shows how easy it must be for these big businesses to just knock on politicians' doors and say, look, I need a favour. And actually, I think what this speaks to is a much deeper and more profound problem. It's not just the case that David Cameron and Rishi Sunak and Lex Greensill are just these bad guys who have been doing this terribly corrupt stuff. They have. But the fact that they were able to do it, the fact that we have this scheme whereby the British state is distributing billions of pounds to some of the biggest businesses in the world, at the same time as nurses are getting this pathetically small pay rise, the people who've been on the front line of protecting us during the pandemic, it shows us what the British state is all about. It's about protecting the interests of big business, the finance sector, the City of London. It's about protecting the interests of those people who claim that they make the economy work, the people who claim that they are making all the decisions that allow us to keep our jobs, that give us the lives to which we're accustomed. And yet, that isn't been what's happened during the pandemic. These people have gotten all this money. They've been, billions of pounds have been distributed to these businesses, to these financial institutions. And yet millions of people are suffering. Millions of people are unemployed. They've seen pay cuts there. Some of them are, really struggling to make ends meet. They've had to take on extra debt just to survive. Our public services are really, at this point, at breaking point, and have been for some time. The average person before the pandemic hit hadn't had a pay rise in 10 years. There is this huge gap between the experiences of the members of this global elite who are always able to rely on the state whenever they come into trouble, and everyone else who is largely told, well, if you've got an issue, if you've lost your job, if you're sick, if you need someone to care for you, that's basically up to you. It's not the state's responsibility to support you. And yet it is the state's responsibility to support people like Lex Greensill. The Greensill scandal doesn't stop with David Cameron and Rishi Sunak. It has now also emerged that Matt Hancock had been pushing, after having several meetings with Lex Greensill, in which David Cameron was also involved in setting up, in pushing for various different NHS trusts, NHS organisations dotted around the country, to adopt a Greensill app, an app that Greensill had developed called Earned. And this app effectively did for workers what Greensill was doing for businesses. It allowed them to be paid before they'd actually been paid, to take down some of their salary before they'd actually been paid. And Hancock was pushing for this app to be adopted across the NHS, basically to allow NHS staff to draw down their salaries early. And a number of NHS trusts did end up adopting Earned, this system that allowed their staff to do this. Now, you might think, oh, well, this sounds like a good thing, NHS staff being able to be paid early, right? But the question is, why is the British state bringing in this basically quite dodgy looking, ultimately insolvent organisation to provide this financing for people who should really not be in a situation where they're forced to draw down their salaries early, because they should be paid enough that isn't an issue and that isn't a challenge for them. Of course, the reason that this has become so important is because NHS staff haven't had enough of a pay rise. They spent a very, very long time with no pay rise at all. And now they've been offered this pitiful pay rise during a pandemic in which they are literally putting their lives on the line. So there's an issue here which is about corruption and cronyism, which is David Cameron set up a meeting between Lex Greensill and Matt Hancock to get the NHS to adopt this piece of technology that Greensill has developed. But there's also a lot of other systemic questions here. Why is the British state bringing in this completely defunct organisation to provide this service, which, if it wanted to, it could do itself? Why do NHS workers need to draw down their salary early? Because they're not getting paid enough. So again, in so many ways, this story is not just about a couple of bad individuals. It's about a completely and utterly just rotten structure. This is another example of the privatization of our NHS. And this is not happening wholesale. It's not like the NHS is being sold off to a private organization. Instead, the NHS, which itself is really a collection of different institutions and in some cases private companies, is increasingly contracting out a lot of its responsibilities to private organizations. And of course, this is something that is not, just happening because NHS staff and managers think we want the private sector to be more involved. Some do, but it's actually to do with the fact that it has become very, very difficult for many NHS trusts to just make ends meet, to be sustainable, because they're not getting enough funding. So you get this spiral of the government cutting funding, the NHS bringing in private organisations, those private organisations lobbying for a bigger role within the NHS that creates this self-reinforcing cycle. And then ultimately, as we're seeing with some NHS apps that provide GP services that you have to pay for, people who can pay see that within the NHS, the quality of service is less good. So they move over steadily to these private providers. And when the middle classes have moved over to these private providers, the government then finds it a lot easier to continue cutting the NHS because it's something that only poor people rely on. This is what they did with social housing, with social security. They make the middle classes exit the system. So it's seen as something that's only used by the poor, and then they cut funding because ultimately they don't see themselves as being responsible for sustaining the livelihoods of working class people in this country. This is fundamentally a question of democracy and accountability. We're told that we live in a system in which we all have a vote, in which we all have a say, in which we can negotiate with our employers, in which we can turn up to elections and vote in our local councils, in national elections, in which we can enter into an economy, in which we are all individually free and equal and can exchange with one another on fair terms. What this story shows is that actually every single system in which we are involved, every single democratic system, every single political, institutional, economic system in which we are involved is to a substantial extent controlled by a small number of people at the very top of our society. And increasingly, those people are insulated from democratic accountability. Lex Greensill is a private individual who had a huge amount of power over our political system. Nobody voted for him. David Cameron, sure, people had voted for him, but he was no longer in office, and he was still able to use his power to change the way our society, our economy, our political institutions work. Even, this question of the Bank of England dishing out funding. The Bank of England is not an institution that's subject to democratic accountability. It's independent. It's separate from the government, which means that the government can say, well, that was all up to the Bank of England. And yet what you end up seeing is people within the bank being lobbied by the finance sector and them implementing policies that end up benefiting a small number of people. So for me, this is really a question of democracy. It's a question of who makes the rules in our economy, who decides who gets what. And yes, nominally we live in a democracy, we have votes, we have rights, but actually so many of the decisions that affect our lives have been taken out of our hands. That's, I think, why there's so much disillusionment in this country. That's, I think, why people sense this need to take back control. It's because control has been taken away from people. Not, by immigrants, not by, the metropolitan liberal elite, but by the global elite, by the most powerful people at the top of the largest corporations, the largest financial institutions, and the biggest, most powerful states. The challenge that we really face now is taking back power and putting real power in working people's hands. That means we have to organise. It means we have to organise in our workplaces to take back control from bosses. It means we have to organise in our communities to make sure that we're all engaged in local service provision and that our councils are accountable to us. And it means organising at the national level to make sure that our politicians can't get away with this stuff anymore. The problem with Keir Starmer's response, which is to say the Conservative Party is cronyistic and covered in sleaze. He's very careful never to use the word corruption, by the way, which suggests a much deeper and more systemic problem. What he's saying is there are some bad people in the Conservative Party. That's why this is happening. And if you boot out the Conservatives and elect Labour, elect me, then things will be different. The problem is that this scandal does not just touch the Conservative Party. It's actually to do with the structures of our politics and our economy. The line that he should have taken is to say that this indicates a deep sickness at the heart of our politics, at the heart of our democracy. It shows that there are a couple of people at the top who can get away with anything, whilst working people are the ones that are left to pay for the consequences of their excesses, pay for the consequences of their decisions. We saw it in the financial crisis, we're seeing it with COVID-19, and we're seeing it with this scandal as well. Starmer really needed to use this opportunity to make the case for a democratic renewal and revival in the UK, to say that we need decentralisation away from Westminster, where all this stuff ends up happening. We need to empower local and regional government, and we need to democratise that so that working people are involved in the decisions that affect their communities. He should have been saying we need to democratise our workplaces, making sure that working people have a say in the way that businesses operate. And we need to democratise our state. We need to make sure that the Bank of England, for example, is democratically accountable. We need to make sure that ministers are accountable to Parliament, yes, but also to the people that they're supposed to represent. We need to get rid of the House of Lords, which stands in the way of that. We need to get rid of the City of London Corporation, which is supposed to be a local authority, but which is actually a massive lobbying organisation. All of these things stand in the way of us being able to say that we really do live in a democracy. In fact, we live in an oligarchy, basically, to a greater or lesser extent. I mean, sure, we have votes, we have rights, and those are things that we really need to fight for and make sure that we don't lose. But ultimately, if we don't start to resist this model, and if Keir Starmer and the Labour Party doesn't start centering these questions of democracy, it would be very easy for those freedoms to slip away without us even noticing. Throughout the press, throughout politics, throughout the media, we've heard the Greensill scandal described as evidence of cronyism or sleaze in politics. If this was happening anywhere else in the world, we would have a word for it: corruption. When things like this happen in poor countries, they get punished. The World Bank, the IMF, their lenders will say, well, we're lending you all this money and it's ending up in the hands of private business people. Or, business people are lobbying to get their own share of this money that's coming from the outside. We would call that corruption. We'd say it's evidence of bad governance. We'd say you can't have access to any of this funding anymore. And yet when it happens here, it's not corruption, it's just sleaze. And what that connotes is the idea that it's someone who is sleazy, that there's one or two people who are doing something wrong, they're bad apples, and we need to get rid of them. But that isn't the issue. The issue is a corrupt system. It is corrupt institutions. It's not just cronyism between a couple of individuals who know each other from school. That's why we haven't seen the big C word, corruption, used to describe this scandal. It's not because it isn't corruption. It's because calling it corruption would imply that we need to really introduce some fundamental changes in how our politics works. So this isn't just a few bad apples. This is a systemic problem. And every time a scandal like this emerges, we see more and more evidence of the revolving door between politics and the private sector. So whether it's Tony Blair, Theresa May, David Cameron, all of our former leaders can go into very well remunerated positions and make a lot of money and retain a lot of power after they've left politics for good. You also see this with, other senior figures like George Osborne, for example, who's an exceptionally good example of this, who went on to have a number of very well remunerated jobs, not just in the private sector, but also in the media. So leaving politics doesn't necessarily for these people mean leaving power. At the same time, we see people coming in from the private sector into politics. Now, this might not necessarily be them running to be an MP, but they will have all sorts of advisory roles. Lex Greensill himself had an advisory role within the Cameron government. And from what we can see, he had a lot of power. There were a lot of people within the civil service who were uncomfortable with the amount of power that Lex Greensill had. And this can be said for a number of different high-profile business people who can gain access to the halls of power, to senior politicians, and say, look, do you reckon you could do me this favour? So we do have this revolving door between the private sector and politics. And it isn't just the case in the UK, it exists in the US and most other capitalist economies. Because ultimately, in capitalist economies, Wealth is power and power is wealth. Now, you might think that many of these businesses want to hire people like David Cameron or Theresa May or whoever else because they are very good at what they do, because they are very clever people, they're very good at decision making, and they're going to provide, some sort of real value to these businesses. But actually, that isn't really the case. It's not just, people who you might consider to be very competent who have gone on to get these jobs in the private sector. Nick Clegg, for example, went on to get a quite senior role at Facebook. And if you look at all the MPs who were associated with Change UK, one of them's gone on to join the Bailiffs Association, another one's gone on to join a water company. They've all gone into roles in the private sector, even though their political careers were examples of spectacular failures. Now, why are these private organizations hiring people to do jobs that, they probably don't really have the requisite skills for? It's because they can provide contacts. It's because they can provide access. This is why Lex Greensill hired David Cameron in the first place, because he knew that David Cameron had Rishi Sunak's phone number. And if Greensill Capital ever got into any trouble, then David Cameron would be able to text the Chancellor of the Exchequer to say, can you give us support? So that's really what this revolving door is all about. It's about cash for access, effectively. So David Cameron, who was the architect of austerity, which, according to the British Medical Association, was linked to at least 120,000 deaths, along with an increase in inequality in our economy and the kind of erosion of trust in our democracy. Cameron was responsible for a lot of the problems in the British political economic model that we are seeing today. And yet he didn't leave office to go and try and fix any of those problems. He didn't leave office to go and, work in the charities sector or to do philanthropic work. He went to increase his own power and wealth. And I think this speaks to this point that actually these people aren't motivated necessarily just by wealth. They're not even necessarily motivated by the idea that they're going to go down in history as some great leader. What they're motivated by is holding on to their power because it provides such a central part of who they are. These people think of themselves as special, powerful people. They think that the rules don't apply to them and that their only job is to retain their power and retain their capacity to make decisions that affect other people. One of the main reasons that Jeremy Corbyn was subject to so much harassment and abuse in the press and from our political class more generally is that he's never really been part of these networks. He hasn't spent his political career lobbying on behalf of big businesses. He spent most of his political career basically supporting refugees, working for peace, supporting people in his community. He is, someone who doesn't really have an interest in all of these things around power and self-aggrandizement. And, arguably was kind of thrown into the position of running for leadership of the Labour Party. Now, that isn't to say that he didn't want to do those things. He obviously did. And a lot of the reason that he was unable to do that came down to the fact that a lot of other people really, really didn't want him to become Prime Minister. But he wasn't motivated by the same things as many of these other people. If he had been, you would have seen his political career look very, very different to what it did. And that is really why he was taken down so quickly and so ruthlessly. It was because people knew that if he was Prime Minister, not only would there be a radical change in the way that the British economy worked and the way that British politics worked, but actually they wouldn't be able to lobby for access in the same way as they could with not just a Conservative leader, but almost any other Labour leader. He didn't accept the rules of the game that exist in these circles. He didn't accept the idea that it was okay to pay for access to the halls of power. He found most of the system of Westminster and parliamentary politics pretty broken, I would say, and spent a lot of his life trying to work to reform those systems. So there was a lot at stake with Jeremy Corbyn potentially becoming Prime Minister. Not only companies being kicked out of the NHS and various different parts of the state, not only paying higher taxes, not only, higher taxes on wealth, not only redistribution, but also a real invigoration of our democracy and a removal of these very powerful, influential people from the corridors of power. Some of you may remember a headline from LBC a few years ago in which Jeremy Corbyn had called on David Cameron to disclose information that had been found in the Panama Papers about his family's finances. And LBC said, should Jeremy Corbyn resign over this call? The idea being that David Cameron was not being challenged. And of course, David Cameron was fine as a result of all the revelations in the Panama Papers. And yet, because Jeremy Corbyn had challenged him, Jeremy Corbyn should be the one to resign. This is a real indication of quite how sick our democracy and our media really is. What is scary and sad about this incident is that it isn't going to damage the Conservative Party. It isn't going to damage Rishi Sunak. It probably isn't really going to damage David Cameron that much. These people are going to continue about their lives. And, yes, there'll be investigations, but ultimately all that means is the can will be kicked down the road and a very kind of mealy-mouthed report will be released in a few years' time. The disclosure of these forms of overt corruption doesn't end up hurting the people who do the corruption. It hurts the people who try to expose it. And we see this time and time and time again. Whenever there's a leak, whenever there's, the Panama Papers or, any organizational group or individual who works to expose corruption is putting themselves in extreme danger. And Jeremy Corbyn, in trying to expose this corruption when he was leader of the Labour Party, really became a lightning rod for the anger of the political and media classes. This is why we need to be making sure that, we're supporting left media like Double Down News, which can expose this corruption and which can do so without fear and actually build up awareness of these issues so that we can hold our politicians to account, because the mainstream media just isn't going to do that. I don't think that Boris Johnson's inquiry is going to get to the heart of this issue, even if there's a slim chance that David Cameron is implicated, is said to have done something wrong and has to atone for his actions. What this inquiry is not going to do is get to the sickness that exists at the heart of our political institutions, which allows stuff like this to keep happening. What we need isn't just an inquiry that's going to take many, many years and ultimately lead to nothing. What we need is a fundamental reform and transformation of our democracy. If we leave it up to the media and our politicians, then these people are going to carry on getting away with scandal after scandal after scandal. That's why it's so important that Double Down News, left media, progressive media, investigative media of all kinds continues to probe, to ask these difficult questions and to expose what has been going on at the heart of our democracy and within some of these big businesses and big corporations. The barriers to doing that are huge, both in terms of being able to access these people, being able to kind of figure out everything that goes on, but also just in terms of being able to speak out about this stuff. Because ultimately, had Greensill Capital not collapsed, had all this information not come to light, it would have been very difficult to hold any of these people to account. Who knows how many other examples of scandals and lobbying and corruption and cronyism have taken place over the course of the pandemic with all of this money being distributed by the government. We only know the things that have come to light, and often they've come to light by accident. What we really need is to be able to have a much greater level of scrutiny over our politicians and over our institutions so that they can be held to account. That is just a fundamental requirement for a healthy democracy. It's that when people abuse their power, they can be held to account and removed from office. And that is what really shows that British democracy isn't working. It's that the same people keep being implicated in the same kinds of scandal, and yet nothing changes. That's why we need to support a media that can play its role in exposing these people and in making sure that someday they really are held to account and the system can be changed.